One of the most significant and controversial Supreme Court rulings in American history occurred in 1857 with Dred Scott versus Stanford decision. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived in the free state of Illinois and the free Wisconsin Territory with his owner before being taken back to Missouri, a slave state. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free territories had made him a free man. The case made its way through state and federal courts until it reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The ruling, delivered by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, was a devastating blow to anti-slavery advocates and intensified sectional tensions. Taney ruled that Scott had no right to sue the federal court because, as an African American, he was not a U.S. citizen. Furthermore, Taney declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in U.S. territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise. This decision meant that slaveholders could bring enslaved people into any U.S. territory, potentially spreading slavery throughout the nation. The implications of the Dred Scott decision were profound. By denying the federal government's authority to restrict slavery in the territories, the ruling emboldened pro-slavery advocates and validated Southern concerns over property rights in enslaved people. The decision alarmed Northerners, particularly abolitionists and members of the newly formed Republican Party, who viewed it as a stark demonstration of slave power influencing national institutions to protect and expand slavery. Republicans responded with outrage, arguing that the ruling threatened to make slavery a national institution and asserting that the Supreme Court had acted under the influence of pro-slavery interests. The Dred Scott decision further polarized the nation. For the South, it was a victory that affirmed the right to own slaves and expand slavery into new territories. For the North, it underscored the urgent need to resist what they saw as an encroaching pro-slavery agenda. The decision effectively discredited popular sovereignty, undermining any remaining belief that the territories could decide the slavery question for themselves. This landmark ruling helped galvanize the Republican Party's anti-slavery stance and made it nearly impossible for the nation to avoid an open confrontation over slavery. The Dred Scott decision had immediate political repercussions, coming to the forefront in the Illinois Senate race of 1858 between Democrat Stephen A. Douglas and his Republican challenger Abraham Lincoln. This contest would not only establish Lincoln as a national figure but also frame the ideological battleground for the future of slavery in America. The debates centered on the future of slavery in the territories and whether it could coexist with American values of freedom and democracy. Stephen Douglas, a prominent proponent of popular sovereignty, argued that territories could effectively exclude slavery by refusing to pass laws to protect it, a stance that became known as the Freedom Doctrine. This position attempted to reconcile his belief in popular sovereignty with the Dred Scott ruling, which had declared that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. Douglas's doctrine was meant to allow territories to restrict slavery without federal intervention, thus appealing to Northern voters while preserving Southern support. However, this position backfired, as it alienated many Southerners who felt Douglas was insufficiently committed to protecting their rights. Lincoln, on the other hand, argued that the nation could not continue half slave and half free. He contended that the expansion of slavery posed a moral and political threat to the nation's values. Though Lincoln was not an abolitionist, at this time he held a deep conviction that slavery should not spread beyond where it already existed. In his speeches, Lincoln framed slavery as a moral evil that conflicted with the ideals of liberty and equality embedded in the Declaration of Independence. He appealed to Northerners by emphasizing the dangers of a growing slave power that he believed sought to dominate American politics. The Lincoln-Douglas debates brought the issues of slavery and sectionalism to national attention. Lincoln's articulate arguments against the expansion of slavery gained him a significant following, and though Douglas won the Senate seat, Lincoln's performance elevated his status as a leader of the Republican Party. The debates also showcased the basic differences between the North and South, as they exposed the limitations of popular sovereignty and underscored the moral and political divide over slavery. The debates revealed that the institution of slavery had become more than a policy issue. It was now a fundamental question about the nation's future direction. The national debate over slavery reached a fever pitch in 1859 with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, an event that both frightened and emboldened Americans. Brown, a passionate abolitionist, had long been known for his militant actions, notably his role in Bleeding Kansas. However, his attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, was a bolder and more desperate endeavor. Brown's objective was to seize weapons from the arsenal and distribute them to enslaved people, sparking a massive slave uprising that would ultimately end slavery. On October 16, 1859, Brown and a small band of followers, including both black and white abolitionists, crossed the Potomac River and captured the arsenal. However, the rebellion faltered when local militia and U.S. Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee quickly contained and captured Brown and his men. Brown's failed raid left him wounded and in federal custody, where he would later stand trial for treason against the state of Virginia. The response to Brown's raid was polarized. In the South, his actions were viewed as the ultimate confirmation of Southern fears. Northerners and abolitionists were willing to resort to violence to abolish slavery. Many Southern leaders were appalled that Brown had received support from Northern abolitionists and saw this as evidence of a widespread Northern conspiracy against their way of life. They warned that similar insurrections could follow and began organizing local militias to defend against potential future attacks. In the North, responses to Brown's raid were more complex. While many Northerners condemned the violence, some admired Brown's dedication to the cause of abolition. His trial and execution drew public sympathy, and he became a martyr for some abolitionists who saw his actions as a courageous stand against an immoral system. John Brown's raid marked a critical turning point, solidifying Southern fears of Northern hostility and intensifying divisions between North and South. The election of 1860 was the most significant in American history, marking the culmination of decades of sectional strife and setting the stage for disunion. The Democrats, the last remaining national party, fractured along sectional lines, nominating two separate candidates, Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats and John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats. This split in the Democratic Party effectively handed the election to the Republicans, who nominated Abraham Lincoln on a platform of containing slavery's spread. The Republican Party's anti-slavery stance made Lincoln an unacceptable candidate to the South, where many viewed his election as a direct threat to the institution of slavery. Although Lincoln did not call for immediate abolition, his opposition to the expansion of slavery was enough to convince Southern leaders that their interests could no longer be safeguarded within the Union. Lincoln's election in November 1860 triggered a wave of secession in the South, beginning with South Carolina in December. The secession winter of 1860-1861 saw 6 more Southern states join South Carolina in leaving the Union. These states formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president and drafting a constitution that explicitly protected the institution of slavery. The creation of a confederacy represented a definitive rejection of compromise, signaling that sectional crisis had reached its breaking point. Northern leaders, including outgoing President James Buchanan, struggled to respond to the secession crisis. Buchanan, who believed that secession was illegal but that the federal government lacked the authority to prevent it, took a passive stance. This left Abraham Lincoln with the task of confronting secession when he took office in March 1861. The nation was now conclusively divided, and the possibility of a peaceful solution had all but vanished.